5 historical misconceptions.
5.
Cinderella wore glass slippers. Historians will argue with you if you suggest that Cinderella's slippers were made from glass. There are over 500 Cinderella stories in existence, with the earliest having its origins in the 9th century. In these stories, Cinderella's slippers are magical and fashioned from gold or silver. In some of the stories, they are decorated with gems, but there's no account of them having been made of glass. In some tales, she has a magic ring rather than magic slippers. In really old French accounts, Cinderella's slippers were made of white squirrel fur. The French term for fur was then vair, but by the time Charles Perrault wrote his version of the story, this word had evolved out of the French language. He decided that it must have been very or glass. New versions of the story have copied the mistake ever since.
4.
Abner Doubleday invented baseball. The popular story involves a committee drawn up in 1907 to report on the origins of the all-American game, baseball. Their findings led to a young lad named Abner Doubleday, then living in Cooperstown in New York. Doubleday was reported to have made up a game he called town ball and had drawn a diagram of the diamond pitch that it was played on. His drawing was dated 1839, and Doubleday became credited with inventing what we now know as baseball. There was a flaw in this story, however, as Doubleday was actually at West Point in the year he supposedly created the new game. He also never followed baseball in the way you would expect its inventor to. Now the credit goes to Alexander Joy Cartwright, a draftsman and New York bank teller. There is a plaque naming him as the father of modern baseball hanging in the Baseball Hall of Fame.
3.
The Germans invaded Belgium and France using the Schleifen plan. Well, this is half right, really. In fact, the plan the Germans used was a variation on the Schleifen plan, and so perhaps should have been named the Schleifen-Moltke plan. Realistically, though, it would be correct to refer to it as the Moltke plan, too. Count Alfred von Schleifen's plan was rearranged by Helmuth von Moltke at the beginning of the war, and it could be argued that Moltke's change spelled failure for Germany. Had they gone with Schleifen's plan, there's no telling whether the outcome would have differed, though, so it's all theoretical, really. Schleifen's original plan was centered around keeping the right wing of the army strong so that they had the necessary power to overcome the Allied forces coming from the north. He was so adamant that this was vital that his last words are said to have been a reminder of this instruction. That's where Moltke comes in. He decided to take large numbers of troops away from the right wing, sending them instead to Alsace-Lorraine. Not only was weakening the right wing at odds with Schleifen's original idea, but so too was strengthening the left wing. Schleifen had instructed that this side of the army was to be kept weak in order to entice the French army into German territory so that they could be surrounded. Because Moltke had strengthened the left side, the French army stayed static in order to protect Paris. The result of Moltke's changes to the plan was static warfare, labeled the Miracle of the Marne. He had managed to create a situation with his plan that the original plan had sought to avoid, leading to Germany's defeat.
2.
Almost everything about gladiators. The media is responsible for spreading all sorts of nonsense about gladiators. One of the most common misconceptions is that these swordsmen fought to the death. In fact, as recorded by Georges Villet, a Roman scholar, the death rate for gladiators in the 1st century AD was 19 in 200. As the years progressed, however, this rose to 1 death for every 3 fights. When a gladiator was killed, the sponsor of the match would have to pay compensation to the gladiator's owner. If a fight looked as though it would end in death, for example, if a gladiator had lost his weapon or had been seriously hurt, then the victorious gladiator would have to seek permission from the emperor before they dealt the death blow. Only the emperor could pass a death sentence, and so if a gladiator inflicted death upon another without permission, he was charged with a criminal offense. Another thing you probably heard about gladiators is the thumbs down gesture being used to represent death. In fact, there's no evidence that this was the case. If there was a gesture for death, it was more likely to have been a thumbs up. One of the big misconceptions about gladiators is that they were prisoners, forced to fight by their owners. It is true that many gladiators were criminals or prisoners of war, but definitely not all of them. There were a number of volunteer gladiators who took on the role for the monetary compensation it paid and the fame that came with it. A successful gladiator would be given a villa to retire to, land, and a monthly payment. You might be surprised to find out that fighting as a gladiator was not limited to men. In fact, women gladiators, or gladiatrix, were really rather common. Roman writers speak of female gladiators in much the same way as the male ones, as though there's nothing particularly special to see here. This tells us that it wasn't a big deal for a woman to fight. Female matches were only put on at nighttime, though. There's some evidence to suggest that these women were from the upper classes of society and sought attention and excitement through their hobby.
1,
Rome fell in a day. Although a common saying, this is not at all the correct way to view what happened to Rome. It all started in AD 285 when Rome was divided into two areas, the East and the West. Each side considered itself to be the continuation of the Roman Empire, but no matter how alike their attitudes, their fates were decidedly different, with the East lasting for 1,000 years longer than the West, which only survived for 500 years. We've all been told about the barbarians which entered Rome and looted it until the city was so weak that the empire fell. However, this is not the whole story, and is only one of the many events which culminated in the downfall of this great empire. Many of these events would not be considered major alone, but they built up over a century before the final fall. The first major event was the Antonine Plague, which wiped out 50% of the population of Rome. This was followed by environmental issues caused by over-farming and deforestation. Then the decision was made to allow everyone within the borders Roman citizenship. This may not seem such an influential thing on the surface, but it had massive consequences for the security of Rome. All citizens were able to join the Roman army, which meant that a vast number of soldiers weren't actually from Rome. Many had never even been there before. This led to loyalty problems, with many of the soldiers more interested in wealth than defending their empire. When the barbarians invaded, many soldiers found that they were better off joining in the looting. An elite group of soldiers was recruited to protect the emperors, the Praetorian Guard. This sounds like a good idea. However, if they weren't happy with an emperor or they weren't being paid highly enough, then they would just kill the emperor, creating instability and unrest. The Praetorian Guard, which was designed to be an emperor's elite bodyguard, was also a very problematic idea from the start. They simply killed any emperor who didn't seem to match their agenda or pay them enough, and this created instability. But at the end of the day, another way to look at the Romans is that they never actually died out, and instead continued in the form of the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire may disagree, though.